Well, a lot of you know an awful lot about these areas already, so if what I'm telling you now simply chimes with what you feel to be right, then I hope you still think it was worth your time being here. And if some of it is new and useful, then that's good too. I'll still talk about we and us in relation to the school that I've now left, almost a year ago now. And often when I say we, I'll actually be meaning probably Sophie or her predecessor Carol, on whom the huge burden of most of the work lay. And my debt to the two of them is absolutely massive, and it's very much down to them that I was inspired to be interested in this area of school life. I would recommend that as a pedant and a classicist, you don't split infinitives in any of your development literature, but in most other respects, the Star Trek model is quite a good one, in that boldness and courage are at the heart of this, but also you'll hear that goes with things like good timing, and actually spending a lot of time getting to know people, these things you know already. I'm going to cover quite a bit, and if it's too much to write down, because I won't have a great deal of information on the slides, they're pictures mostly, then if you would like some more detailed notes, I'll very happily let you have those if you leave me an email address. You've heard a bit of my background. Christ Hospital was a place with a bizarre uniform. I lived in North Yorkshire, so travelling home we had to travel in uniform. It was an interesting experience. I was once taken for a priest by a drunk on York Station who was keen to confess to me. In my naivety as a youngish teenager, I didn't realise that I could have sneaked my own clothes into my luggage and changed on the train. These sort of things I learned later. I owed a huge amount to the place, though interestingly, in talking in a moment about motivation to give, I haven't got to that stage yet where that feeling of gratitude to the place has been worked on by them to the degree that I could be used as much as I might be. I don't know whether anybody from Christ Hospital is here. I better be careful in what I say. But it was a place that served me exceptionally well. And I suppose I had 9 years of almost free education there, and some life experiences that set me up very well for what followed. Which was Oxford, and pretty well 4 free years there because of the nature of the climate and education at the time, and government grants and so on. In fact, I even had a small scholarship, so it was a profitable thing going to Oxford, rather than having anything to pay at all. But you can see why I would think that where I am now and what I've been able to do and the job that I've had has depended a huge amount on those opportunities offered to me at a much younger age, firstly at school and then at university. Now then, this is the key thing really, the two big questions. What does a school want from its former pupils, its alumni, and what the alumni want from their former school? A bit of contextual stuff, which will be clear to many of you already, is that the great majority of adults want nothing whatsoever to do with their former school, not that they didn't enjoy it, it's just that they moved on from it to other things in life. And therefore don't be surprised, and I'm sure you're not, that you're dealing with a small minority, a significant minority, but it is a minority of those who went to your institution who will have any interest at all in what you send to them. It's not a reason not to send mass mailings and emails and so on, and all the social networking, but don't be disappointed if the response is actually a limited one. The attachment grows stronger as you get older. You'll have learnt that too with your alumni. But of course the young love to stay in contact with each other, and that needs to be very much exploited because the young now, maybe in 20 or 30 years, might suddenly feel very fondly and sentimentally about their old school, the men in particular, and that could be the time when they might feel moved to generosity. But in the meantime, they can be used in all sorts of other ways. And I hope that one of the things that we managed best at King's was the engagement of youngsters in doing useful things for us as a school. Those who are least happy at school can often be the most supportive of their school's current vision if they can be engaged. So not having enjoyed life at your school doesn't mean that these people won't be interested in helping. You know that too, I suspect. And the least successful often turn out to be the most successful in life, so cultivate your rogues while they're still with you. You never know what they might achieve. And visiting your old school, remember this when people come back to your reunions, brings a flood of memories, and not all of them good. And remember that when you're talking to people, that actually reunion dinners can be quite difficult occasions at times, and it's worth getting people to talk through those memories, some of which could be unexpectedly sharp for them. Alumni aren't greatly motivated to give money to buildings, we mostly know that. You can work very hard without very much return, but in the end, you probably create your own luck. There is luck involved in fundraising, of course, but it tends to come from hard work and creating the right sort of field. Grateful parents and former parents, as you know, can be powerful allies. And a particular tactic of putting together alumni and current pupils, as I'm sure you've also discovered, works very well indeed. Now, these key questions. Why would I want a relationship with my former school? Can you all think now back to your school? And just put that question to yourself. Do you have anything to do with them? If not, why not? If so, what is it that actually motivates you to have any contact? And what's the nature of that contact? For me, I suppose I give to my former school and my former college. But I think the thing that would make a big difference to me perhaps is some personal engagement. And so often it's to do with being given a small job to do, anything at all that would make you feel, actually, there's a reason here to try and find out a bit more. If I went back, and I haven't been back for years, I'm ashamed to say, what would I want to do or see or hear about? Interestingly, when Carol, who's back there, was development director, we ran a couple of phone campaigns. And I'd just come out of assisting with one of them in a room in the school and got home, and the phone rang, and it was a former pupil of Christ's Hospital ringing me to ask if I would give them some money. And I recognized the script to be exactly the same script as we'd just been using. And so when he'd said his spiel, I said, excuse me asking, but are you actually being trained by this particular company? And he was a bit thunderstruck that I might know anything about it. And then as I reflected, I said to him, we've had a really interesting conversation, but I've realized, and I may not have thought it before, that what I wanted was for you to ask me about my time at the school. I didn't want you to tell me about how the school is doing now, as you have been, and very interestingly, actually I simply wanted my memories indulging. And that was a useful thing to learn, and I started to put that into effect, I suppose, in all my relationships with alumni in my own school that I ran. And remembering that when people come back to reunions, you can show them around the school and tell them proudly of all the things you've done, but probably what they most want to do is meet old friends and relive those memories. Go to some of the dirty corners that you didn't want to show them, but they actually want to see, because that's what will trigger the memories that made it worth going back. So remember that. I think that's most important. How would I feel about being asked for money? Well, it would very, very much depend on the context, and that sort of call over the phone elicited a small amount of generosity from me, but not very grand. And what would motivate me to give more? Well, a bit more on that in a moment, and some examples. This is a picture of a rather fancy building by the Jewish architect Hundertwasser, Friedensreich Hundertwasser, in the town of Magdeburg in East Germany, with whom our school had quite a relationship. Former East German, communist-controlled for 40 years town, very depressing place in every respect, except for, although actually it's much cheerier now, but when I took this picture, this was a wonderful, heart-raising, morale-boosting, zany, wacky building that started to give the place some pride in itself and some life. Let me take you back to the start of the journey for me. When I became head in 1998 at King's, assisted places had just been abolished by the new Labour government. There was no bursary funding in the school, a very small intake in my first year. Recruitment had not been good in the last year of my predecessor. It was just about the end of boarding, so there were large numbers of empty buildings. The alumni community was not engaged. There was a small and faithful alumni committee. The first modern inspection of the new regime was imminent. We had strong local competitors. There had been no new buildings for about 10 years because all the investment had gone into turning the place into a co-ed institution very successfully. But of course it was very newly co-ed as well. Not a very promising environment, and yet it was a great school with great heart. There had recently been published a league table in the Times of chief executive officers with the largest redundancy payments. And we were slightly embarrassed to find that 3 of the top 8 had been to our school. More of that later. A governor's question at interview, are you prepared to run an appeal within your first 5 years? Well, what do you answer? Of course, I said yes, having no idea what that might mean. The concept now of an appeal, of course, now seems rather old-fashioned. 3 years in, the work really began. I suppose it took that long for me to get my feet under the table, and we did the obvious things. We began a bulletin to the alumni, we established some legacy literature. With some advice from somebody who'd done some fundraising, we embarked on a business directory, which was not at all successful. It was a dead end, really, but it was one of those things that you try and fails to try and raise a bit of money and get parents interested. We extended the scope of reunions, and we made the alumni weekend a bigger event. We appointed an appeal chairman, who was a wonderful man and had a big influence over the next few years. He was both a governor and a former pupil of the school, and a very supportive person. And we began to set about having a proper alumni database. All these are very basic things now, but crucially, we then appointed a first development director. And Carol was a wonderful choice, not because she had any background in this sort of work. She did in fundraising, but not in this sort of work in schools. But she had the experience of having been a parent at the school. She did know about fundraising, but the important thing was, and the thing that commended her, was that she had bags of what one would call emotional intelligence, and those sort of personal skills that were going to enable her to undertake an extraordinarily difficult job of being the first development director in this school. Governors had to be got on side. Carol was very good at that, and they needed to be persuaded that they would have to invest for a long time before they saw any return. Sophie, I don't know, did you bring the documents in question? Oh, right, yes. Exhibit A. It's wonderful seeing these things historically. So this is what we produced in 2001, and it had an outline of the sort of things that we thought we might do. But reading back over it all these years later, actually we achieved everything that we had put in there to do. Some of it was highly aspirational. A lot of it was to do with a well-resourced education for our pupils, and the chance to be offered to those who couldn't otherwise afford it, in other words, raising money for bursaries. This man was absolutely key in our plans. He has been the architect of a whole series of buildings that have greatly enriched the school. And one of the particular advantages of John Christophers, the architect, was that he was passionate about everything he did, and he loved to stand up and talk about it, even though he was quite a shy man. But he was very persuasive. I think there's a message in that in itself. Well, we did all sorts of things. We hoped to have some libraries. We had 3 schools. There was a senior school and 2 junior schools. We wanted greatly to improve the outdoor facilities. We had old boarding houses to find new uses for. Sport was short of space and investment. In the junior schools, we needed extra facilities like a kindergarten. We certainly needed an AstroTurf pitch, because our playing fields flooded every year. And we needed aspirationally things like a new art department, a new music school, a new boathouse, and all sorts of things. This bit of stained glass on the left was produced by us around this time, a little bit later, by a former pupil. And it represents the journey of a young person through education. And the blue bit, he called it, I think, the tree of knowledge. The blue bit in the middle is a stylized tree. The red dots are a representation of the school's badge. And the stepping stones, if you like, that go through the middle and take interesting routes, represent the passage of a young person through education, starting slight and insecure, taking various directions, and then emerging strongly, firmly, and purposefully at the other end. I've used this so many times in talking to parents, prospective parents, pupils themselves, new to the school, because it says a very, very clear message about what you hope will happen in the process, and there are lots of things in that mix. But it did help to ground me in all sorts of ways in talking to alumni too, that actually they were there not to do something different from the core purpose of the school, but to help us with that core vision which was not going to be any different for them than it was for a prospective parent. The relationship between the development director and the chairman of governors, I would commend to you as crucial, and make sure that those two people get to know each other well and trust each other. If that works well, then actually the governing body will be on side, and everything that is done in the development office will be understood. A bit of luck came our way. We bought a couple of pubs because they were near the school and they fell on bad times. And that enabled, in a rather cramped city centre site, the opportunity to find some space. And then over the years, many millions of pounds later, many of which were raised through the work of the development office, we have a set of extraordinary facilities that have been added. So, for instance, an iconic boathouse on the top left, a new library top right, the AstroTurf pitch that we'd always needed, a new art school, and opening in 2 weeks' time, formally, a very grand £10 million facility, which is substantially sport and drama, but many other things too. Now, I want to take you through, though, the business of building relationships with key individuals, because that's been so much a part of it. Not in a scientific way, but by giving you just a few examples of individuals who I shan't name, but I'll describe briefly the circumstances. Number one was quite early in the time that Carol was with us as the new development director, and without any particular prompting or work needed by the school, he promised us £250,000 as a legacy. And this was based on his own happy experience of school and the fact that the next generation of his family was very happily engaged at the school. And that business of families over time, I don't know what your schools are like, whether it is the sort of school where the children and the children's children may end up at the same school. But those connections are invaluable if you can really get to know a family well. Number two is somebody who came to an event and hadn't been back for years. He rather approved of what the school was doing in the present time, hadn't enjoyed his own education very much, had some issues about the way he was taught, but had a house in London, no other resources particularly because he's a lecturer, and felt that he would like us to have that house as he had no children of his own when he died. He is still very much alive and well, and we wish him a long and prosperous life. But that act of generosity is something that lies in the future and will be wonderful when it happens. Number three lives in the US and understands very much the USA approach to giving, that business of an expected generosity to your alma mater, and therefore is absolutely au fait with the sort of things that we were trying to do. A very busy man, travels all over the world, gets very tired, and therefore wants his time to be used efficiently and well. But loves to meet with his peers, wasn't actually very happy at school himself, but approves very strongly of what the school now does, and often came back to visit his mother, who still lived in Worcester, and hugely appreciated the fact that the school had taken the trouble to look after his mother a bit, that people went to see her, and that, I think, was a particular reason for his subsequent generosity in funding bursaries. And number four, a man who was also on that list of redundant CEOs who were given a very high payment, and played very hard to get. He'd given to the school back in the 1980s, but then, for all sorts of reasons, rather liked being courted, but put up various barriers to the idea that he might give, some of them to do with the school's academic performance, because he'd been there when it was effectively a grammar school, and now, of course, it didn't have all those bright people coming through funded by the state. But actually, in more recent times, after many, many years of careful relationship building, he has been more generous and probably will be more generous still. And he's a very good case in point of somebody who may seem not to want to engage, but the fact that he likes coming to events and comes back to them is an indication that probably he's simply waiting for the right question to be asked in the right way. And that's again where the courage comes in. Next one is the presenter of one of the most famous quiz shows in the world, who didn't like his old school much at all, and still doesn't want a great deal to do with it. Very high publicity name, And when the publicity was bad publicity, when he wrote about what a horrid time he had at school, we were slightly embarrassed by it. But in the end, through a connection, he was persuaded to come and be recorded on video, saying something in support of the campaign we were running for a new building. And that meant a huge amount, and it was a matter of very skillful management. And a lot of people were involved in that. And it was, again, finding the right moment and the right line, and being fairly bold with a man who himself did not lack self-confidence. Next one, just a couple more. Had been away from the school a very long time indeed, was at the school in the 40s, hadn't been back for any reason. And then became more engaged, came back to a dinner, and rather approved of what was going on. And in the end, he became the chairman of the development trust that was set up at the school, and has been a huge ally to all those working in development. It's hard to know exactly what made the difference in his case, but clearly he'd had very happy memories himself, and he liked the re-engagement because I think people genuinely showed an interest in his time at the school, and then found him a job to do, and he was retired and was delighted to put his skills to our service. I'm going to skip now to the last one, which was probably the biggest one and the most significant. And this is somebody of that same generation of the man I've just mentioned. I think it was 49 years since he'd last crossed our threshold. Was persuaded by his friend to come back to a dinner and met some others whom he'd known and had a very happy time. The result of that was a gift of £1,000. And he came back a year later, enjoyed the dinner again, and made a further gift at the same level. At that point, Carol went to visit him in Devon. He couldn't come the next year, but he was talked through the possibility of funding a complete bursary for 7 years. Carol spent a lot of time with him, got to know the family, and all that led, as he started to become rather ill, to an engagement with the family that became very supportive, I suppose, from the school's side, as indeed the generosity from the family's side increased. They offered £1 million that might be a legacy, or it might be even in the man's lifetime. And in fact, it proved to be the latter. And then the other members of the family came to the school, showed an interest. They'd had a bit of good fortune in their business life. The possibility of a boathouse was mentioned, as that was something that this man had always enjoyed while he was at the school. And Carol was brave enough to say, well, this is what we need, and this is what it would cost, and actually you'd have to give us that full amount, because there's no other way we could come by that money. And the full amount was in the end forthcoming. But that was a result of getting to know a family really, really well, spending an awful lot of time with them, getting to know them across 3 generations, in fact, inviting them to lots of events, not because we were using it as part of a scheme, but because we genuinely wanted to get to know them better. And in all these things, what are the common features? It is taking your time. It is particularly understanding the motivation, which is different in every case, of why somebody might want to come back to their school and might want to give. Of course, it's about building relationships. It is judging the right time to be bold and to ask the direct question. Very often, it's a question of finding somebody a purpose and a job to do. And I think at the heart of it is being prepared to enjoy getting to know your former pupils, not to see it as a chore, one extra thing added on to, for instance, a head's busy life. I shouldn't be showing a picture of a hurdle when we're 2 days on from the Derby. I hope you all saw that wonderful race with Frankie Dettori riding to victory. But there are many hurdles in the way, and I'll go through some of these only. One for us was that the end of boarding and the fact that we became a co-ed school meant that a huge number of the alumni no longer really identified with the sort of school we'd become. And many of your places will be like that. You're simply not the place that they were at. And you can't change that. All schools have changed massively over these years. For us, these were 2 particular changes. And all that means is, I suppose, when people come back to events, you really, really have to do your homework well. You have to understand what the school was like at their time, and make links, of course, with the present. Of course, they're encouraged to hear that their school is still doing well. But as I said before, they really want to be indulged a bit, and therefore you've got to put in the time to understand what their experience might have been like. The time and expense of establishing a development function is an obvious hurdle, and it does take time, and it is going to be very expensive, and part of the head's job is to persuade governors and bursars that this is going to be a good investment and that it's in for the long term. It's easier now because I think there is no doubt that this is something that every school should be doing, and you can't go into it with half-heartedly, with only a measured level of commitment. It must be something that if you're going to do, you do properly, you invest in it in money as well as time. And the head's time and focus is a very difficult thing. Heads are very, very busy people, especially in large schools, and life gets increasingly more complicated. And the time really is giving time, I suppose, to meet with your development director and to hear what they need to hear. Sophie described our meetings, and sometimes I would find myself meeting with Sophie when I had a million other things on my mind. And she prepared very carefully, and she made sure that she put a few things in front of me that she knew I had to focus on, asked me to make a few decisions, and we took it from there. But in the end, if the head is not relentlessly positive and upbeat with everybody about this aspect of the school's work, it is not going to be very successful. It really, really does need that strong lead, and it must be seen as a very important part of the job. Otherwise, it isn't worth making that investment. And part of the reason for this is that teachers are never going to be strongly supportive in large numbers of the development function in a school. That's simply because of who they are and their background. They didn't go into the job because they want to raise money. They went into it for many different reasons, but they're educational and idealistic about getting the very best out of children. Of course, they see the point of it, but they're very busy people and they won't want to be very, very engaged. And therefore, managing that is very, very important. It is finding the key players, those who really do understand it to the degree that they want to help. And then it's engaging the senior pros, of course, who know many generations of more recent leavers, because actually they would rather enjoy the opportunity to be engaged with them again. A bit more on that in a moment. The alumni committee, that's often a difficulty in schools where this is a new idea, and the alumni committee can be quite against either having its powers, an area of operation taken away, or usurped as they might see it. In the case of King's, it was very, very easy in many ways. They were a delightful group of people who were almost relieved to have some of the jobs that they used to do taken off them, so long as they were still given important things to do. And it needed a great deal of skill and care from both Carol and then Sophie to manage them and to help them to be absolutely aligned with what the school needed to do in a rather more professional way. But I know there are schools where that's been a much more difficult area, and it does need time and patience and understanding why these people may have been involved in the first place for a very different sort of operation than the one you're now offering them. We had a certain degree of experience of mismanagement of earlier appeals. There had been an appeal which, for instance, promised an all-weather pitch many years before, which for practical reasons couldn't be delivered. And there was a lot of resentment about this among part of the community, especially those who'd given money for that particular purpose. And that could be an issue with you, in which case I think honesty is the best policy, and good dealings with those who you know might have been particularly involved and whose expectations and hopes were let down. The economic climate is something you can't predict or manage, but of course you've got to work with it as it stands. The perception that there are more worthy charitable causes is always going to be a hurdle, because quite reasonably some of those who you might want to be generous to you would say, when you look at all the problems in the world, I'm afraid the bursary requirements or the facility requirements of your school, even though I love being there and I could afford to do something, come fairly low on the list. I used to use the line sometimes that if a school, a secondary school, let's say, is doing its job really well, and in our case, with about 140 leavers each year, was turning out into the world 140 really balanced, well-motivated, energized people who were highly principled and had learnt to be givers in life, then actually that school was making, in a small but significant way, a contribution to both the community and the nation. A line of thinking along those lines is not a bad one to put in terms of whether a school is really a charity. It's a very privileged sort of charity, but still it is doing a good job in society. And of course there's always that fear of upsetting people by being too direct in asking, and that can be a hurdle. And sometimes you've got to use judgment in deciding when the right time to ask is, and then actually you've just got to be bold and say, this really is the right time and I will ask those questions, and judge correctly what is the right level at which to ask. This picture is an interesting one in that it shows, when it was taken, the oldest and the newest part of the school. In the foreground, a commemorative tablet saying that this was the site of the oldest crossing of the River Severn, and in the background a brand new boathouse thrust out across that river. That ability to engage the past and the present in all the alumni work is a very important one. If you have a historic site, it's made all the more easy. But you need to find ways of linking the past and the present with everybody who comes to your different events. But on to some good decisions and useful practices, and here are just a few. Whenever Sophie and previously Carol met with me, Sophie, particularly in more recent times, would bring me a chart which very clearly, under different headings, gave a timeline of exactly what was planned to do in different aspects of the operation. It was very easy to assimilate, and therefore very easy to focus in a short meeting on the things that really mattered. It's such an obvious thing in a way, but if it's not something that you do, that business of having your strategy and vision clearly and diagrammatically written out so that you can check how you're doing against your own targets is very important. Clearly you need, among your alumni community, if you're going to use your time sensibly with a small staff, to have a clear idea of who your best prospects are going to be. And that requires a lot of homework. It needs research, it needs the drawing up of careful profiles and carefully understanding the background and motivation of those individuals. But putting a lot of time into a focus on a fairly small number of individuals is not wasted time. And then the stewardship of both those who have given and those who have said that they are going to give is absolutely vital to the work you're doing. We also found that having an effective body of people made up largely of alumni themselves, a development trust as we call it, and it has similar names in many places, made up of highly competent, motivated people who were prepared to give time and expertise and guidance and encouragement was one of the greatest steps forward. We did our best to celebrate generous acts, so when people give money, of course you want to make that clear in the literature, but don't over-egg it. Don't try and bully people or emotionally blackmail them into thinking that they should be as generous as others have been. That is not a motivating factor in giving. Dinners of all sorts, of course, the established dinners, but dinners for carefully targeted groups around particular individuals we have found to be quite successful. And that will happen when the right people come along and they're very keen to meet with their friends and the environment is right. Getting alumni to give practical help and leadership is an obvious thing to say, but it's something that I think we managed to do with a great number of people over the years. And engaging people in practical help as a stepping stone to their later generosity, whether you expect that or not, is such an obvious link. You will not be generous to an institution until you've thoroughly understood it from the inside, if possible, and be given a job to do, perhaps, and therefore feel, I suppose, closely aligned with the direction in which the institution is heading. Another member of the development staff at King's, Alice Brunt, is going to talk later today on the role of the school archive and the way that the archive is used in alignment with the development office is very, very important indeed. It is, if you've got an archive that's well resourced and well run, then it makes absolute sense that these two bits of the school's operation should work as closely together as possible since they have so much in common. If your archive is a bit under-resourced, then give serious consideration to raising its profile. It can unearth endless resources that will engage, amuse, and help for alumni to recall their times at the school. And of course, indulging their memories is going to be a key thing through pictures, through the people they meet, through the places you take them when they visit. Carol pointed out to me very early on that having the development office in a central location was absolutely essential, and that if you put your development director anywhere out on the fringes, however good they may be, it is going to be a struggle to be part of the mainstream in your school. If possible, and it isn't always possible for accommodation purposes, make sure that they can be at the heart of things. Now, the relationship between the development director and the governors is a crucial one, and the chairman I've mentioned already. We've got into the habit at King's over time of trying to have as many opportunities as possible when governors are meeting for having members of the development team present, that there should be a good rapport and regular easy social contacts, as well as occasionally presence at governors' meetings, seems to me a vital part of a proper understanding on both sides. Cultivating the role of former staff has been a particularly successful thing at King's, partly because a lot of them still live locally and really enjoy being invited back to events. But then putting them to good use is the next step. When we've invited key speakers who have been former members of the school, we've often invited some of their old teachers to come and meet them, maybe for lunch, maybe just to come and hear them talk and have a brief chat afterwards. But it's very flattering to former teachers to feel that they still have a role to play, and it's worth keeping up those links with people who have been at your school and are still alive, however far they may be. But if they're local, they are a great resource. We tend to have them all back for as part of a lunch during the main alumni weekend, where they meet each other. They create their own community of former staff, which they really enjoy, and therefore are all the more ready to be used in a variety of different ways. We found also that in terms of new staff, going to the other end of the spectrum, that the function of the development office and those involved in it should be an important part of the induction of new staff is essential. New staff have their opinions very quickly formed by those whom they come into contact with in their early days. If they meet the cynics in the common room, then they may have a certain view about the way the school is run or the importance of various bits of the operation. You will all have very effective induction programs, no doubt, but making this a very significant part of it so that the development office has the chance to explain itself and its function and how they can be involved in a whatever smaller way as new teachers, that seems to matter. They need to know that this is a respected and important aspect of the school's operation. And that goes also in terms of general staff awareness, the importance of using your development director to address the staff regularly. It might be once a year, twice a year, to update them on the work of the office, to explain the logic of what's going on, always backed by the head, never done in isolation. Because that, again, that this should, to all the staff in the school, be seen to be a very important part of its operation, which they won't remember in between times much because they are very busy, again, is an important priority for a head. And when they leave, you will have various ideas, I'm sure, about how to maintain the contacts of recent leavers. We found that a 5-year reunion was a very, very effective bit of the operation. These are some of our leavers on their fancy dressing up day, the day before they go off on exam leave. And it forms part of a slightly developing relationship with them, where they're no longer quite your A-level pupils, but for the first time they're allowed to really let their hair down, and they're allowed to enjoy a day of each other's company in a way that might reasonably make them think, actually, it would be good to go on doing this from time to time. And we get them back 5 years after they've left. This group were the very first group who came back when we did this. These were the leavers of 2005, so they came back in 2010. A significant proportion of a fairly small year group came back. It was a wonderful summer's evening, and they just had a great time. And that gives you the basis then for updating them a little bit about what you're doing, which they're not all that interested in, but crucially, making sure that they're in good contact with each other. If you can keep maintaining those links within year groups, which are now so much easier with the improvement of communication and social media. It takes time, but it's worth having as a priority within the office that these groups are kept together in ways that maintain their interest in each other and a little bit with the school. And of course, in that group, there are a number who we've used in all sorts of ways to come back and talk to younger pupils over the years with great advantages on both sides. And that business of using exemplary alumni in front of the pupils in the school is such an important one. We developed something called the Barnabas Society. I chose the name Barnabas because St. Barnabas in the New Testament was synonymous with the idea of encouragement. That word is used of him. So we wanted a slightly mysterious name that summed up the idea that you would call back somebody who had left the school at some point in the past, who had done interesting things in life and who could trace a link between what they did at school and what they're now doing, interestingly, in front of the assembled school, and then spend a day with us and meet with smaller groups, perhaps meet with some of their former teachers if they were a youngster. This is a girl who left about 8 or 9 years ago. She is now a journalist. She's been working in television in France, in Washington, and now in New York. I was out in New Zealand earlier this year and turned on the television, and there was her face speaking from Washington about the advance of ISIS in the Middle East with huge confidence, which completely belied the very shy girl who fetched up at our school all those years ago. This chap is the artistic director of Radha, another very energized former pupil. And Claire, whose wedding I'm going to in August, is that rare thing, a female engineer, but who's also won the MBE for work with charities, with villages, through a charity she herself set up in Cameroon. A great girl and somebody who came back inspirationally to speak to the school. And a couple of last things on that, just before I begin to wind up. One is that in the bulletin that goes out to parents every week, we have a former pupil of the week. A simple but effective mechanism of making sure that we keep thinking of interesting people who we might put forward to the school body as somebody who was at the school and has done interesting things. It's an excuse to contact them and say, we have made you the former pupil of the week, and hope that will be of interest, and then perhaps that might lead to an invitation. And then lastly, going back to the idea of leavers, I've always felt that the time that the head spends with leavers towards the very end of their time at the school is absolutely critical in helping them to have that positive image of the place that might induce them to want to be connected with the place in future. The contribution of development to the school community, to summarize all these points, strikes me to be the following things. It is the aspirational example set by former pupils to current ones. That's just as valuable as all the money raised, I strongly believe, in the school that I ran. Having, over time, scores, even hundreds of former pupils coming back, engaged with the school, offering their help in assemblies, in conferences, in all sorts of other ways, in mentoring and giving advice, working with the careers department, has been of huge value. In helping the school to engage in the best elements of its tradition and history, in raising for the staff the idea of the resource that to them is represented by former pupils, to come and help in all sorts of ways, including in lessons. When we've had people back, we've tried to encourage our colleagues to use them in academic lessons to enrich what they're doing. But parents are also very impressed with a school that shows that it is using the wider resources of its wider community. And to be able to say to your parents that we use as part of our community people from any generation who've been there before, who have valuable expertise to offer, is an encouragement to them that the school is not only interested in a child during the years that that child is with them. And there are many opportunities to celebrate events of the school's history. Pick those carefully, but it's not difficult to find a reason to have a celebration of an event. And that's a nice excuse to invite lots of people back. The financial benefits to the school are obvious. New facilities arising from money raised, the annual fund that might contribute to things that otherwise couldn't be afforded, and of course the future promise of legacies is going to make a massive difference to all our schools. But above all, for me, I suppose all this work was an incentive to be absolutely clear in my own mind as to what the core vision of the school was, and to communicate this same vision to alumni as I communicated it to pupils, to parents, to staff, and to prospective parents. And lastly, just a few priorities for the leaders of the school. So for the head, articulating that vision clearly in a way that links past and present, and indeed future members of the school, is absolutely core to this work. And keeping as the main the main focus of that vision, your aspirations for young people in the school, is not only vital to them, but it's very attractive to those who used to be at your school. And if you can also engage interestingly and generously with your local community, that is impressive too. It's impressive to your parents, it's impressive to alumni. You must give the development director in your school a high status. If it's appropriate for them to be on the SMT, make sure that that happens. Make sure that he or she talks regularly to your staff. You yourself must support the development team and put yourself at their disposal. And when they ask you to do something, do it willingly and thoroughly. And if they give you interesting research and background, read it and assimilate it to the best of your ability in a busy life. And in the development work itself, obviously you need a clear strategy and a sense of priorities, because with a small staff, as you're likely to have, you mustn't expect of them more than they can manage. Keep your staff well informed, not only by putting your development director up in front of them to say what they're doing, but by yourself reinforcing the value of that role. Prepare really, really carefully for all events, again, to the best of your ability and as time allows, so that you feel you know the people who are coming and can show some understanding of them when you meet them. Try and make sure that all those who leave the school leave with a sense that they were valued, cared for, however well or badly they did, however engaged they were, that they mattered to you, that you knew who they were, and that their future development is of interest to you. That will matter too. And manage the expectations of governors very, very carefully. By the nature of their role, will have an eye to the finances, which might be at variance sometimes with the best way of running a development function in a school. Look after those who've helped you, and that goes on for years and years. Make individual approaches and be bold when the time is right. But most importantly of all, understand that you will only, I think, secure the generosity of those important few if they detect a culture in your school which really embraces the idea of a community that embraces all those who used to be with them and is not just after their money. If the school really seems to enjoy the involvement with and the company of its alumni, then that's a prompt for people to be generous. So as a head, be the inspirational leader. If you're a bursar, embrace this vision and be prepared to spend rather more than you might be comfortable in spending from time to time. And as governors, please recognize that this must be a very time-consuming part of the head's and indeed the bursar's role, and that it must be given time and priority in your understanding of their role. Two final slides. In Berlin, there is a massive monument to all those who died in the Holocaust, which dominates a lot of the prime territory in the center of the city. It's a very powerful but blunt and uncompromising statement. But there is another sort of memorial to all those who died, which is in this form. These are called stumbling stones or Stolpersteine. And they are just slightly raised brass plaques that when you walk over them, prompt you to look down because something under your foot was not aligned with the rest of the pavement. And I've always thought that those two sorts of memorial were interestingly different ways of achieving awareness of something that's important. I hope this is not an inappropriate comparison to use. But this particular one was a useful way, in a very subtle way, of engaging with the individuals who walk around the city, all over the place in small but individual and personal ways. And it seems to apply to so many things in life, that some of the things you achieve by the big event and the big statement, and others you achieve by the subtle engagement with individuals. And lastly, this is a picture from Worcester Cathedral, and it's Adam naming the gardens in the Garden of Eden, one of which is naming the animals that are in the Garden of Eden, one of which is a pink giraffe, which is probably the only pink giraffe in the world, and it's in Worcester Cathedral. And I try to encourage the youngsters at the school to see themselves as pink giraffes, as being unique, one-off, importance in their own right. But if you can also make a proportion of your former pupils feel just as loved and cared for as you do the current pupils, then you'll be a long way to understanding what makes a development function really successful in your school.